Good morning. Hopefully you guys are seeing Brandeis Part 2, Scientific Management. Okay. From the landing page at BP. Rise of the Expert Series, Brandeis Part 2, Scientific Management. So the efficiency movement that's going on today with DOGE, Department of Governmental Efficiency, right? This is the word that's sneaking under the radar. It's one of the main tenets of progressivism. You can see how they're tearing down the administrative state that Brandeis built, but all they're doing is renovating. They are updating. This model has worked. They're just going to now make it digital. We're all going virtual reality here. So there's never been a more important time in human history than now to talk about the principles of scientific management. And you're looking at the man here, Louis Dembitz Brandeis, who coins the term. I include these people here with him because this is, Henry Gantt. This is Frederick Winslow Taylor, the author of the principles of scientific management. This is why this movement is called the Taylor system or Taylorism. It's named after him. So if you've ever heard of this, you've probably heard it called Taylorism. But it's really the scientific management of people. And I go through this in other work. I think The House of Truth and The Devil's Agent. We talk about Robert Grosvenor Valentine, the owner of the House of Truth. They all come out of the William Howard Taft administration. Frankfurter, Dennison is the other guy from the House of Truth. I couldn't remember yesterday. Who throws himself in front of a train, apparently. There's a lot of death in this story, right? Frederick Winslow Taylor himself dies not long after the publishing of this book. Same with Robert Grosvenor Valentine. All under shady circumstances. So these are, as far as I'm concerned, murder cases over 100 years old. It sound a lot like today. But without any further ado, let's move on. So Henry Gantt, anybody knows what the Gantt chart is? And then these two ladies help Brandeis legislate. So we talked about Brandeis being in control of all three branches of the American government, the executive, judicial, and legislative. Well, obviously being the author of the president's campaign, The New Freedom, well, also being a U.S. Supreme Court justice, while also being the people's attorney or the people's lawyer working here with National Consumers League, you can see that he's legislating, he's advising the executive, and as the first Jewish U.S. Supreme Court justice, he's a radical. Some of the names we went over yesterday that people were calling him. So Florence Kelley, founder of the National Consumers League, and Josephine Goldmark, they're key people here to understand. And this book in the background that I've included here, Fatigue and Efficiency, this is all of their work, all of the publishing, all of the books that needed to be written and disseminated is all basically funded by Russell Sage. So that's the executive arm of Skull and Bones. So we're showing that this coterie of progressives come out of the Taft administration, create the House of Truth. This political salon 1 mile from the White House, you guys got to check out. This is the origins of Mount Rushmore and the flipping of the definition of liberalism. Mainstream will say that the House of Truth was the political salon that saved liberalism. But this is what they did is coined the term neoliberalism in 1938. And they've been uh, putting one over on the American Western public in general ever since. So the Brandeis brief was submitted to Judge Brewer during the landmark 1908 Supreme Court case Muller versus Oregon. This is a incredibly important moment in history. If you were to go to law school, you'd learn all about Muller versus Oregon. Where the court was considering the constitutionality of limiting women's working hours. Brandeis hired by the National Consumers League to counsel in behalf of the state of Oregon. So Brandeis was hired personally by two of its most influential leaders, the NCL's chairman of Publications Committee, Josephine Goldmark, and its executive director and co-founder, Florence Kelly. Josephine happens to be the sister of Brandeis's wife, Alice, which under normal circumstances makes her his sister-in-law, except Alice, Josephine, and Louis are all second cousins. So Kelly, along with Jane Addams and Josephine Lowell, created the League to correct through acts of reform legislation the unsatisfactory working conditions inherent to unregulated industry. What they were really doing was establishing the framework to a new international system of manufacture and trade. So we talked yesterday about it. First, they had to make America compliant to be able to fit into the world international system that they're going to start to create starting in 1916. I mean, they're already establishing it under Theodore Roosevelt. They've already done the Spanish-American War. They've already started the Panama Canal. I'm not sure how long it went on, but Roosevelt and the Progressives started all of that. So you can see that they're already well on their way to their international model. Paris Peace Conference in 1919 is where they really lock it into place. But prior to that, they have to make America congruent to it, compliant, so that it all fits together and America actually is the hub of it all. You can see that's really the driving force of all of this, because they certainly didn't ameliorate the poor, did they? Seems to be a residual of this society. So the quote, the Nation's Consumers League was founded in 1899 by Jane Addams and Florence Kelly and Josephine Lowell as a social reform movement concerned with the conditions under which goods were manufactured and distributed. The League promoted the creation of administrative agencies to enforce protective legislation and played a major role in defending reform measures in court. So the emphasis there is added. I italicized. National Consumers League's records at the Library of Congress, Washington, that's from. So we're just showing you how it was created and why. It was concerned with the conditions under which goods were manufactured and distributed. And they promoted the creation of administrative agencies. So this is the creation of the administrative state to enforce protective legislation and played a major role in defending reform measures in court. So Brandeis famously introduced to the courtroom an as of yet never before seen technique in arguing case law, giving birth to a revolutionary new sociological jurisprudence covered in more depth in a later two-part article we named Brandeis Part 6, The Science of Law. We've talked about that a little bit yesterday. And we did mention the Brandeis brief because we knew we were going to go over it today. Simply put, it was the combining of sociology, quote, the science of social order and progress, end quote, with law, quote, the most specialized engine of social control, end quote. The insertion of the scientific expert in the concept of law across the nation. They're establishing law. They're establishing American law that we still abide by today. So the law, an underappreciated aspect to the social control of society, despite it being the most obvious. Having already spoken of Brandeis's influence on Wilson and the executive branch of the U.S. government in Brandeis Part 1, Architect of the New Freedom, we now tell of the events that led to Brandeis's transformation of the judicial and legislative branches, first as a nationally known radical reform attorney, and then as a confirmed member of the highest legal seat in America, the U.S. Supreme Court. So we can see Brandeis' home at 6 Otis Place. This is where he was living at the time that all of this was going on. The meeting at Brandeis' Boston home between he and the founders of the NCL marks the beginning of a legislative altering relationship that would last at least another decade. Once Brandeis was confirmed as a justice of the Supreme Court, his responsibilities as legal counsel to the NCL were taken over by his young protege, Felix Frankfurter. Brandeis, a famous mentor-protege, brother, father-son relationship. Frankfurter, the most loyal of Brandeis's lieutenants. So Josephine Goldmark describes the nascent moments of the Brandeis brief. Quote, on November 14th, 1907, Florence Kelly and I were actors in a little scene, which, though of course we did not realize it then, marked a turning point in American social and legal history. We had come to Boston to see my brother-in-law, second cousin, Louis D. Brandeis, then a practicing attorney in Boston, and we sat in the back library of his home on a little street called Otis Place. We had come to ask Mr. Brandeis to appear in the Supreme Court of the United States to defend the Oregon 10-hour law for women, attacked as unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. Brandeis looked thoughtfully out over the Charles River and accepted. Thus began a collaboration between Mr. Brandeis and the Consumers League, which gave a revolutionary new direction to judicial thinking, indeed to the judicial process itself. That's all funded by Skull and Bones. A total overhaul of the legal system, admitted right there in her memoirs. Whatever source number 2 is, you can go down. Let's go down and look. That's right from her memoirs, the reminiscences or something like that. The Impatient Crusader, Josephine Goldmark. That's her words. And there's a picture of the back deck at the old Brandeis home overlooking the Charles River. Just to help one's imagination. But we like to confirm all of these things because, you know, we're trying to present something of beauty. So, quote, he, Brandeis, then outlined what he would need for a brief, namely facts. You guys know what I think about facts. They are subjective too. Published by anyone with expert knowledge of industry in its relation to women's hours of labor, such as factory inspectors, physicians, trade unions, economists, social workers. If I could return to Boston within a fortnight with such printed matter sufficiently authoritative to pass muster, we would then work up the material in the form of a brief. This is what becomes the Brandeis brief and really, you know, every brief since. The addition of social science. Josephine Goldmark's work as a reformer in the progressive era did much to redesign the American social contract. End quote. Jewish Women's Archive, Josephine Goldmark. Right here. Talking about fatigue and efficiency. Louis Brandeis, National Consumers League. Hopefully that followed me over and you guys are looking at the same screen I am. Jewish Women's Archive, Josephine Clara Goldmark. Okay. So there she is admitting they are redesigning the American social contract. This is the moment that I realized it when I saw this quote deep into my research. Well on my way to the 10-part series, I was like, whoa. They're the literal makers of our matrix. These are the people that designed our system. And here's how they did it. So, you know, we talk about the things that have happened, and we talk about the organizations and secret societies that are doing things, but here's the proof. Here's the source material, and we're going to need it. So The Brandeis brief set the method of argument for other landmark minimum hour cases in 1909, 1912, and 1914, as well as minimum wage cases in 1913 and 1914. Brandeis was assisted greatly in the collection of material by Josephine Goldmark and the NCL, and the entire scheme heavily funded by the Dorothy Payne Whitney, the Russell Sage Foundation, and the Fabian Society. So Dorothy Payne Whitney is a major funder of the New Republic, and her husband, a representative of J.P. Morgan. Can't remember his name at the moment, but that is in our work as well. So consisting of over 100 pages of sociological data, Brandeis's brief devoted only 2 pages to legal argument. Largely due to the efforts of Brandeis working with Goldmark, Kelly, and the National Consumers League at the height of the Progressive Era, we see the pioneering moments of arguing case law using facts and statistics, data, 3 things susceptible to a wide array of subjective opinion. By getting law to change with a progressive society, they created a new living law. It's moving. So here's the motion, steered by social science research data. And that's why it's so important, because they move us off our moorings. This is why it's so important to understand this myth of human progress. It's the one thing that's going underneath everybody's radar. So turning the feedback loop into a social reform perpetual motion machine. I think we talked about this feedback loop aspect. Yes, we did in the first video, Bowman, Tools of the Trade. So the opinion of the social science experts now presided over the courtroom, just as in the Oval Office. I wrote this before we saw Musk and everything going on. Traditional legal precedent and the US Constitution were both deemed out of date and promptly tossed to the wastebasket. This is really what they were doing, because the US Constitution as a document or as a thought and an ideal is immovable. Our rights to think and speak and assemble freely are immovable, non-negotiables. But in order for them to get us off of our moorings, what we stood on for values and traditions, the granite upon which we stood, they shook it all. And it's all deliberate. It's all on purpose, as we're showing. So, quote, Miss Josephine Goldmark states, the Brandeis brief in the Mueller case, reprinted together with Judge Brewer's opinion, was in great demand from law schools and universities, as well as from labor unions and libraries. Gone was the deadening weight of legal precedent. So what they really did was they drew a line and said, from here on out, everything changes, but we get to set precedent now. This is really why they wrote all those books in 1913, 14, the new democracy, the new freedom, the new nationalism, the new spirit, the new precedent, right? The new sociological jurisprudence, new law, the new republic. Judge Brewer stating in his final assessment before examining the constitutional question to notice the course of legislation as well as expressions of opinions from other judicial sources, the brief filed by Mr. Louis D. Brandeis is a very copious collection of these matters. But in regards to the facts found within the brief, Brewer admitted may not be technically speaking authorities, and in them there is little or no discussion of the constitutional questions. So he's bringing it up in his final assessment that this goes against the US Constitution. There's no discussion at all of the Constitution. So this is Comte's positivism. We still see it today. We're moving forward. No time for your stupid questions. Climate change is real. It's like, yeah, but you just used the wrong definition. We're not arguing that climate change is fake. We're arguing that global warming is. You can see how they've switched it now. Now it's a climate crisis. And we knew this literally 30 years ago, that they were going to slowly evolve this global warming and the definition of it to then become climate change, to then become a climate crisis. And so here we are. We watched it all unfold. And how are they doing it? But through these scientific models, collection of data, and trust the science. And there's no questioning their methods and means, because the ends are going to be perfect. They often talk in this future perfect tense of language. So Brewer admitted rightfully that facts aren't the truth and quantitative evidence isn't necessarily qualitative. In the new precedent, the judge himself becomes witness to the settling of law through copious collections of facts and statistics, right? The judge really becomes at the whim of stats, facts, data. Brewer noting they were not technically speaking authorities in themselves, adding for the record that there was little or no discussion to the negative effect the attorney's radical method might have on the U.S. Constitution. So according to David Bernstein, law professor at George Mason University School of Law, much of the information found in the brief was of dubious nature, calling the collection of facts nonsensical and miscellany and hardly definitive. Owen Fisk, Sterling Professor Emeritus of Law, Yale University, and author of The Troubled Beginnings of the Modern State in 1993, concluded Goldmark's collection of evidence as a hodgepodge. Sound familiar? It's been going on 100 years. So in 1914, Goldmark was sponsored by the Russell Sage Foundation to write Fatigue and Efficiency, this book that we see in behind. Once again, demonstrating the direct involvement of Skull and Bones. Both the New Republic and the Russell Sage Foundation donated both manpower and money to many NCL causes during this time. Dorothy Wayne Whitney, the wife of JP Morgan financier Willard Straight, paid in full all the cost of printing all the briefs dating back to the very first, the Brandeis brief in 1908. So here's a image of the Russell Sage Foundation. You can see bees in a hive. That's really what they want us all to have, is a hive mind. This is really what they're working towards, a liberal hive mind. This is the driving force of the New World Order. We see it really established at the Paris Peace Conference, like we talked about in the first show, that the American delegation there was largely progressive left. There wasn't a conservative among them. And the enemy, the Central Powers, weren't even there. So remembering here that Whitney and Straight funded the founding of the New Republic in 1914 with Brandeis, Lippmann, Herbert Crowley, and Felix Frankfurter, other progressive magazines were American Magazine, Collier's, Cosmopolitan, McClure's, Munsey's, and The Independent. These magazines sold for 10 or 15 cents a copy instead of the 25 and 35 cents charged by the older magazines. Now we see them do this throughout the 20th century. They'll give you free magazines. If they can't break through, they've got so much money, they just say, okay, we're gonna make it free until we catch everybody's attention. Kind of like how cocaine's always given to you for free the first time. So once they could get constitutional law to change with the times, it no longer possessed its timeless inherent value. The foundational nature of the U.S. Constitution, being its most enduring and important quality, was the largest deterrent for the authors of all forms of social control. And here we see the onset of a deliberate undermining of the foundation of America. Judge Brewer felt it necessary to state officially for the record in his court's opinion that it is the value of a written constitution that it places in unchanging form limitations upon legislative action and thus gives a permanence and stability to popular government. Yet Brewer still ruled in Brandeis's favor, and the sociological school of thought first put into practice by Brandeis spread across the country, eventually evolving into the dominant philosophy of law in America for the remainder of the 20th century. So Goldmark would continue her legislative activism, mostly with Frankfurter following Brandeis's election to the Supreme Court in 1916. But by then, Brandeis had established much of the foundational framework, much of our modern day social contract, from the hours we work to how we work to where we work, all formed, not surprisingly, during these critical peak progressive era years. So let's get into the Taylor Society. And this fellow here, Frederick Winslow Taylor, he is the author of this book. And I'm going to point out right away, for those that are unfamiliar, here is a cover of the 1913 publication. So 1911, it first comes out. And it's only distributed among manufacturer owners, capital, and engineers. Anybody tell me what that is right there? That's fasces. This is where fascism enters America, right here. This 1911 edition only distributed to engineers and shop managers. Note the fasces on the front cover. So what is fascism but really conjoining of government and private practice? So public-private partnerships, you heard those lately? I mean, it is so out in the open, this fascism, that you see people routinely going from office to back to corporations like Microsoft. We've talked about this. Julie Brill, the former director of the FTC, just goes back and forth between government work and Microsoft. This should be highly illegal in a democratic society. But you can start to see how they took advantage of us through our vulnerability that was created through a collective choice to become blissfully ignorant. Right? And this was deliberate, okay? I'm not out there, I'm not calling any ignorant. I'm giving you actually a mulligan. You know, these people did a lot of things behind our back and behind closed doors that are so secretive and dubious and nefarious that, you know, a lot of us don't think like they do. So it seems preposterous, seems absurd to say that there are people in this world taking advantage of us like they are, right? But this was deliberate. This is why they inserted the scientific expert as a governing voice for society, because you've created now a chasm, a void in the minds of the general public. Now they just trust the scientific expert opinion. This is why nearly every headline you see, it'll refer to some sort of expert. Experts say, or 17 intelligence agencies admit, right? And so what is Elon Musk? But he's like the poster boy for the scientific expert entering wedge. You know, his son comes in there, picks his nose, wipes it on the Resolute desk, and the next day, an institution is removed from the Oval Office and sent for light refinishing, is the quote that they use. I mean, so what that really means is it's a declaration of war in many ways, I'm telling you. And I don't want to spread fear of the future, because I think when we know, it's empowering. When we know exactly what's happening, it's empowering. But, you know, when his kid wiped his nose, picked his nose and wiped it on the Resolute desk, that Resolute desk has a lot of historical meaning that we went through already. So you guys can appreciate that. So on to the Taylor Society finally. Scientific management demands preparedness. The results attained through scientific management depend on universal preparedness. The same preparedness is invoked for industry, which is secured to Prussia in her victory over France. That's Louis Brandeis, scientific management and the railroads. So there he is admitting that scientific management is not only just about efficiency, but preparedness. And this is a large enough military to fight 2 world wars. This is what PNAC talks about. This is what they talked about. This is really what America's role is. The might is right philosophy that goes back to some very interesting sources. So this idea of a scientifically governed society, not original to our modern times, but Brandeis an undeniable central figure in its modern incarnation. Brandeis most responsible with coining the term scientific management and popularizing what many argue today is the most important ism of the 20th century, Taylorism. The whole country at once recognized the importance of conserving our material resources, and a large movement has been started, which will be effective in accomplishing this object. As yet, however, we have but vaguely appreciated the importance of the larger question of increasing our national efficiency. That's in the introduction to the principles of scientific management. And I think I include some of those pages here. You can see that this is really about war. The whole country at once recognized the importance of conserving our material resources, and a large movement has been started. This is the World War I buildup. So Taylor's major contribution towards our present-day industrial democracy largely goes unnoticed by a disinterested public until now. They built this disinterestedness. This is one of the terms that they use. They wanted a disinterested public, not interested in politics and whatever's going on. So Taylorism, as it is known today, was a revolutionary new approach to workshop efficiency. Taylorism driving the efficiency movement that introduced to the world entirely new concepts like organized labor, industrial management, industrial relations, and scientific management. By the election of 1912, Brandeis counted some of the nation's leading engineers, such as Frederick Taylor, Henry Gantt, Harrington Emerson, and F. Lincoln Hutchins, among his most trusted advisors. That's page 47, Louis Brandeis, The Making of Regulated Competition. So Brandeis took a very hands-on approach, marshaling publicity by exploiting his many very influential contacts within the political circles and press clubs of New York, Boston, and Washington. Brandeis organizing the meetings with the leaders of the newly formed Taylor Society, writing out the method of argument for everyone to follow, coordinating, collecting, and coaching witnesses. Here again, we see Brandeis gaining influence over a group of important people possessing important technology. So it's the coercion of the intelligent creatives, just like they do with the Master of Arts degrees and Bachelor of Arts degree graduates. And the K through 12 identifies the most coveted type and covets them, collects them, steers them in the direction that they want. And this is still going on today. And they're all fueled largely, they're compartmentalized. I don't think that all of them fully understand what's going on. They only sort of know their own role, but this is the compartmentalization of American society. This is the division of labor in the mind. This is the administrative man. So they went from blue collar factory workers to the white collar office workers in the cubicles. This is what I was trying to get to in the Crisis of the Expert series. We're going to show that, and we are going to get to that. I am going to put those videos out. It'll be 5 to 6 videos showing you. We're going to go through the Walter Lippmann 2022 conference that was done during COVID as the sort of signaling of the Crisis of the Expert in due time. So in October, Brandeis met at Gantt's apartment in New York with Frank Gilbreth, Jim Dodge, and others. Other management pioneers such as Henry Gantt, known for his Gantt chart, and Frank Gilbreth, known for his motion studies, Morris Llewellyn Cook for rural electrification, Carl George Barth for his speed and feed compound slide rule, all collaborated with Brandeis in bringing scientific management to life. Brandeis even writing the foreword to Gilbreth's Primer of Scientific Management in 1914. They would famously combine Gilbreth's motion studies with Taylor's time studies, forming an entirely new discipline, time motion study. Heard that before? This is the total machination of the human being, making him into a machine. This is the first shaking of hands, really, figuratively and literally, because they're grabbing now the mechanisms and the controls and pushing the buttons. This is the introduction of man to machine now. And this is where singularity, all of it comes from. This collection of men, early pioneers of the cybernetic, eugenic, and later technocracy movements. Okay, I wrote this last year. So Brandeis described scientific management as a revolution in industry comparable only to that effected in the transition from hand labor to machinery. So this is an advancement from that initial handshake, really. And that's page 43, Brandeis Beyond Progressivism. Philippa Strum. You see that? Brandeis, beyond progressivism. So Taylor to Brandeis. Please let me congratulate you most warmly upon the masterly way in which you marshaled your forces and presented your testimony, and also upon the publicity with which your testimony has received and the interest by the papers all over the country. See, Brandeis is close friends with Hapgood, Norm Hapgood, and Norm Hapgood's like the editor of Collier's magazine, one of those ones that we mentioned earlier. So Brandeis has kind of editorial control because he comes from Harvard Law School. He knows how to be an editor. So does Frankfurter. So does Lippmann. They all took. They're the founders of the New Republic, and the New Republic is basically becomes the mothership of all progressive ideas. So they then, like AP influences ABC and everybody else. Brandeis and his regime influence everything below. It's sort of a top-down information transfer. And that is Frederick Winslow Taylor congratulating Brandeis because of the publicity that has been built out of the Mueller versus Oregon case and then the other ones that came out of it. It created a sensation, kind of like Musk with his chainsaw. The large stumbling block was presenting to the labor unions an agreement the workers would accept. Nearly to a man, labor revolted at the thought of being scientifically micromanaged. We all today have this negative connotation when we hear micromanagement. That's the scientific expert entering wedge. This is why we have problems with this middleman. And you see this middleman entering our lives everywhere. And the key here is to understand that it's removing us from source, much like the media removes us from the source of whatever material we need to understand, primary source material, like the things that I'm showing you now, that start to really show you how far from reality the mainstream media has taken us. So labor was readily able to understand and agree with Brandeis that employers would, without involving large capital expenditure, gain great productivity from labor, reduced labor costs, more efficient use of plant and equipment, lower interest in taxes, lesser depreciation charges, reduced stock of raw and processed materials, and lessened strain on credit. However, they could not understand or agree with Brandeis as to what employees would gain from scientific management. So it's this one of these empty promises. We promise you that you're going to be in control of your own labor and the means of production, but they don't get it. So it's underlying, more than underlying Marxist aspect to all of this, because Marx is a journalist at the First International in the mid 1850s, around the same time that the Marxist Revolution, or the Marxist Manifesto is published, and the 1848 revolutions happen, of which Brandeis' family are a large part of. So here's the key to understand about Robert Grosvenor Valentine and the technological advancement he brought right before he died. So in studying the resistance of organized labor to scientific management, Valentine came to see that the objection lay not so much in the thing itself as in the fact that it was introduced by the employer and for his own advantage. So it was a little bit of a mind shift on how to present it now to the worker and say, oh, but you're going to be in more control. You're going to be able to have more say in working hours and all of these promises. And this takes me to Larkin Rose's Mr. Jones's Plantation. This is a great analogy, not just for life in the state, under a state, but life under a trade union. So in the story of Mr. Jones' Plantation, the plantation owner is having trouble motivating his black population of cotton pickers. And so he brings in another black man comes in to solve his problem. He's a problem solver. He's a fixer. And he says, let me talk to the people. And that's what he does. He soothsays. He talks sweetly to them and says that you're going to be in charge now. We're going to have votes. And you're going to have more say in the direction of this plantation, and you're going to share in the value and the profit here. And so they all get behind that and believe a different idea and become productive again. But they're really just in the same role, just like the brand changes. It's a slight change in how you want to look at it. And Larkin Rose's Mr. Jones's plantation is a great example to show how this progressive trick has happened and how they did it through everything. And one of the most important places they did it was the use of the trade union, because you could manipulate or influence or persuade a board of, a dozen men even, a lot easier than you could persuade or influence or manipulate millions of workers or hundreds of thousands of workers or thousands of workers. So this is why the Fabian ethical socialists loved trade unionism, because this was the way that they were going to bring in the entering wedge to create an industrial democracy, right? So that's a profound change in perception. You're going from perception to perspective now. So the substitute of machinery for unaided human labor was the great industrial achievement of the 19th century. The new achievement to which Dr. Taylor points the way consists in elevating human labor itself to a higher plane of efficiency and of earning power. Henry R. Town, President, American Society of Mechanical Engineers, forward to Taylor's shop management, 1910. So he puts out shop management a year prior to the Principles of Scientific Management. And this is why that book, The Principles of Scientific Management, becomes so popular, is because he's already known for some breakthrough technological thinking on how to advance the labor of man to be more efficient, more dependable. This is why they created this assembly line that the man stands on now, because you could just speed up that assembly line and make him work as fast as you want. Understand? And so the Ford assembly line comes from Taylorism. Wasn't invented by Henry Ford. So the sort of the exclamation point of this show here today is a further discussion on the Protocol of Peace. This is the document that Brandeis writes himself. He's the primary author. He's called in by a group of attorneys that can't figure out how to do this. So this is why they call him the sage advisor of all. Comes in and creates this Protocol of Peace, bringing together labor and capital, much like the culmination of the movie Metropolis. So Brandeis, described the protocol system as a large step toward industrial democracy. So that's establishing Fabian socialism. That's what that means. Eventually came the Protocol of Peace, a revolutionary new industry-wide labor standard, bringing together Valentine's industrial relations with Taylor's Principles of Scientific Management, forming Sidney Webb's industrial democracy. That's how they did this. It was the long-anticipated partnership between capital and labor, a sort of syndicalism of shared responsibility and shared compensation. The labor unions and their leaders were the scientific entering wedge between man and his own labor. New York City, the center of American industry, was the proving ground, and the Lower East Side became their laboratory. This is what they talked about. New York and LA, both experimental laboratories to see if some of these hypotheses would work. And if they did in New York, they were made popular around the nation. This is why we see the 60s counter-revolution and all of those things sort of centering around Los Angeles, the center of cool. So it was in many ways the domestication of the human being. And once standards and protocols were established in NYC, they quickly spread across the entire country and adopted industry-wide. So industrial democracy was a term that before 1909 had significant relevance only for reformers and intellectuals. Events in progressive era New York grounded this abstract theory into the streets of the Lower East Side. The conflicts of the ladies' garment industry provided a ready-made laboratory. The Protocol of Peace, a radical trade agreement in the New York City's ladies' garment industry, ushered in a new experiment with industrial democracy. When the Protocol of Peace was signed on September 2nd, 1910, it ushered in a new era of industrial labor relations. It's American Jewish Archives, Protocol of Peace. The strikes set the stage and organized both workers and owners into powerful groups necessary for an industry-wide agreement. Industrial Democrats used this canvas as provided by workers to paint a new picture. Men such as Louis Brandeis and others marshaled the power of social science and used their influence to broker deals to gain a seat at the industrial relations table. And not only does he gain a seat, but the chair. And here's some actual, I consider these primary source documents, even though they are digital. You can see here's the letters from Taylor to Brandeis and back and forth. So you can, if you want the clearer ones, I can give you those too, because they are clearer than that. You just can't zoom in as well on this website. Okay. So industrial democracy provides an important lens through which to view IR during the progressive era. That's industrial relations. Industrial democracy was one of the handful of ideas that defined progressive era reformers. It signaled a new scientific approach to labor in America, as well as a fundamental recommitment to democratic principles. So this is really how it's floated under the radar because of these sort of misperceptions, sort of half-baked ideas, uninformed opinions. Once you gain some knowledge, some dependable knowledge through reading their own literature and their diaries and, looking at what happened unfold, you can clearly see. And it's amazing here that they say that what defined the progressive era reformers was this industrial democracy. The overall driving force was to create this industrial democracy, like we talked about. Democracy for them started on the shop floor and then through the shops across the nation. And then apparently we were all going to be living in a democracy. So the protocol of peace fashioned by Brandeis to settle the second strike was a unique and revolutionary institution. It gave workers collective bargaining and brought about improved conditions, better wages and hours, safer and cleaner workplaces, and a host of other important reforms. And certainly it did. Obviously, there was major positive changes, but the end result was putting us all into an invisible prison where we're slaves, into a wage slavery system. This is what we need people to understand as we're watching Musk come out on stage with a chainsaw and walking around in the Oval Office with a blazer and a t-shirt and allowing his kid to pick his nose and wipe it on the Resolute desk. The clockmakers' strike of 1910, to use Samuel Gomper's apt phrase, was more than a strike. It was more than a strike. It was an industrial revolution because it created a new system of industrial relations, finished what started in 1909. The signing of the protocol as the contract that ended the strike was called, as historian Louis Levine has noted, ushered in a new period of constructive experimentation in collective bargaining. Benjamin Stolberg, another earlier historian of the Union, believed that the Protocol of Peace marked a decisive turning point, in part because its basic idea was later copied by the other needle trades, and in time its influence spread throughout American industry. Do an early life check on Stolberg. Gompers. Levine, right? So the Haymarket Affair of 1886, the Homestead Strike of 1892, the Uprising of 20,000 of 1909, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911, the Cloakmakers Strike of 1910, the 1913 Phelps Dodge mining explosion, and the 1914 Ludlow Massacre were just some among many high-profile labor wars that erupted out of the Industrial Revolution, all served as a catalyst for a radical reform of industry relations that led to a complete overhaul of American life. A separation of history into a before and after. Have we heard that before? These labor wars, part of the Great Revolt in the US that coincided with the Great Unrest in Britain and the Great Labor Revolt in Canada. So you can see it's all happening across the world at the same time. And like we said, the principles of scientific management are translated into all kinds of languages, including Russian and Chinese, and are used openly and admittedly by Stalin, Lenin, Trotsky, Mao. And you can see quotes by all of them commending, lauding this Taylor system. So it's all happening at the same time, exactly the same time. They're using this technology to enslave the world, not just America. Okay, that's a crazy statement, but nonetheless true. When you look at the source material that we provide and you look at the history, you are living in the times of, their children of the future. They were doing this all for you. So as you can imagine, labor revolted at the idea of such control measures we find normal today. The workers saw no advantage for them in their being managed scientifically. They saw only in the scheme what we witness as undeniably true today, that the worker was never meant to share in neither profit nor leisure. The manufactory exploited the human being to its own advantage, and today we bear witness to a system ridding itself of labor entirely, as was the plan from the beginning. Brandeis helped force into reality an entirely new promise of American life. The progressive plan pushed through, sharing no expense. We see the breaking of the old American spirit, the first staggering steps of the rugged individual, and just as today, perhaps the most reformatory period since the progressive era, change and moving forward are all done in the name of efficiency and preparedness. And this was written well before we had all of this talk about efficiency today. So we're predicting the future through a knowledge of history. Here's all of your sources. I hope you enjoyed that. There's going to be some more in between articles now, as people are bringing me some very interesting things that I'm going to start adding to these stories. But until next time, people, cheers.